Hi, my name's Shanice and I'm here to talk to you today about 11 tips that are going to help make your photographs more colourful, more vibrant, more awesome and just all round more interesting for your viewer to look at. So the first tip that I want to look at today is leading lines. Now leading lines is where you're using lines in whatever scenery you are photographing, whatever subject you're focusing on in your image, to draw your viewer's eye to what you want them to look at in your photograph. So for example, you might want to use the lines of a road to draw your viewer's eye to something that's in the background. So the idea is that when the person who's looking at your photograph views it, their eyes will follow the lines of the road to whatever's in your background, so the mountains in your background, or that lake that's in your background, the building that's in your background, whatever it is that you want to draw your viewer's eye to. So that is essentially what leading lines does. It's using lines that are there to draw your viewer's attention to whatever you want them to focus on in your picture. And the second point that we're going to look at is inclusion. Inclusion is all about thinking and considering what you want to include in your image. So do you want to have lots of details that are there included in your photograph? Do you want to kind of zoom in and fill the frame with just the part of your image that you want to be in the frame of your photograph? So for example, say you're photographing a beautiful building in a city and there's some construction work happening next door to this building. You need to think about, do you want to have that construction site in your photograph? What kind of message is that going to give to your viewer if you've got that in there? Or do you want to crop that out when you're photographing? So think about how you want to fill the frame and what you want to include in your photograph and what you don't want to include in your photograph. By doing that, you're going to help get a much more effective image that looks good and keeps your viewer interested. And the next thing we're going to talk about is framing. So framing is really simple. It's where you use something that's there to frame your subject. So for example, framing could be done with doorways, framing can be done with windows, with alleyways, even arches. Whatever's there that you're going to be taking a photograph of, think about what you can use to frame your subject. So you might have a person that you want to photograph and you're going to take their portrait, and there's a beautiful archway in Paris, for example, so for example the Arc de Triomphe, you might want to use that to frame the person that you're photographing. So framing is all about using what's there to frame your subject. Again, to draw your viewer's attention to that subject and get them focusing on what you want them to look at. The next thing we're going to talk about is reflections. So using reflections, again, that's thinking about how you want to use reflections in your image, what part of the reflections you want to include in your image. So again, going back to inclusion, all of these kind of things are linking in together, as you can probably see already. So it's thinking about how you want to use reflections in your image, thinking about if you want to use reflections in your image. So for example, sometimes if you're taking photos through a window, you're going to get the reflections of whatever's behind you. So it's thinking, do you want to include those reflections in your photograph? Or do you want to capture whatever's through the window without the reflections being in your image? Maybe there's a puddle and you want to get the reflections in the puddle, or a lake. Maybe you want to use that to your advantage and put the reflections into your photograph. So it's all about thinking how you want to use reflections in your image, if it's going to look good, how it's going to keep your viewer interested. And the next thing we're going to talk about is a little bit more complicated, but it's known as the rule of thirds. And basically, it's to do with dividing your image into a grid. And the idea is that the intersection points, so where the lines of your grid meet, is where the eye is naturally drawn to when you're looking at a photograph. So for example, you draw a grid like that in your head, you're not literally drawing a grid like that. So basically, the idea is that by placing your subject in a certain part of your photograph, it's going to help make your photo a little bit more balanced. It's going to look more natural as well. So typically photographers will do this by placing their subject off centre a little bit And the idea is that your eyes are naturally drawn off centre anyway. So by placing your subject off centre, it makes your image a lot more natural, makes it a lot more appealing for your viewer to look at, and just gives kind of a more balanced weight to your photograph. Okay, the next thing to consider is angles. So that's basically thinking about, do you want to shoot your image straight on to your subject? Do you want to go slightly off centre yourself to your subject and maybe shoot at a 45-degree angle? So it's thinking about what angle you want to take your photograph from. Again, it also comes to kind of how high up or low down you want to shoot. So what vantage point do you want to use for your photograph? Do you want to be really high up and looking down on your subject? So for example, do you want to go onto the rooftop of a building or rooftop of a car park, that sort of thing, and look down at the city and photograph from that kind of vantage point? Do you want to come low down to your subject? So for example, if you're photographing a child, that works really effectively if you come down to their level. Those sorts of things. So it's thinking about what angle, position you want to put yourself in for when you're shooting your photograph, and kind of what vantage point you want to photograph from. So do you want to be high up, low down, whatever's going to work best for your photograph and to make your image look that much more interesting. Okay, the next topic we're going to talk about is distance. So that is basically to do with how far away or close you are to your subject. So is it appropriate to get right up close to them? Is it more appropriate to be further away? Maybe you want to capture more in your image. So again, that comes back to inclusion. How much do you want to include in your frame? How far away do you want to be from your subject? All those kinds of things. Maybe you're in a beautiful city. Again, I keep coming back to the example of a city, but it's really good for thinking about how you want to take your photographs. So maybe you're in a beautiful city again and you want to get a lot of the landscapes. You're going to want to come further away from your subject. Equally, maybe there's a specific detail point of a building that you want to photograph. So you're going to go close up to that subject and really get the finer details of that building in your image. So it's thinking about all those kinds of things, and there again going to help make your photographs that much more interesting. And the next topic we're looking at is pattern. So that's thinking about patterns and kind of symmetry that are out there when you're photographing and how you want to use those in your image. So it's thinking about repetitions that might be there. Maybe you're photographing plants and there's some patterns in there that you want to look at. Maybe you're photographing buildings and there's beautiful patterns in the brickwork of the building that you want to utilise. So thinking basically how you want to use patterns in your photograph, thinking about what's there, what you're taking a picture of, and how you want to utilise these things to make your images look more interesting. The next topic also kind of links into patterns, so it's texture. So again, patterns and texture, they kind of go hand in hand, but it's thinking about what you want to do with textures that are there with the subject that you're photographing. So, for example, maybe it's a wall of a building that's got paint peeling off it and you want to photograph that. Maybe it's a really old derelict church or something that you want to photograph, and there's lots of textures on the walls, textures on the floor, on the furniture, those sorts of things. And bringing those things and those elements into your photograph makes your photograph become a bit tactile then. It makes whoever's viewing your image want to touch it, and it can make your photographs just that more interesting by including pattern and texture into your photographs. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk about is colour. How do you want to use colour in your photograph? Going back to the example of cities that are out there, places like Barcelona, Paris, cities that are in Turkey, cities in Greece, all these kinds of places with beautiful, colourful scenery that you want to photograph. Think about how you want to incorporate colour into your photographs of those places. Think about, is there something that really stands out colour-wise? For example, a red telephone box or a red post box might be something you want to photograph, and you're using colour that way. Picking something that's really bright and stands out in your image. Maybe that red post box has got a green backdrop, so for example it might have trees behind it or a green wall or something, and you want to photograph the way that those two colours kind of react with each other in your photograph, thinking about that. Maybe there's repetitions of colours in an area that you're photographing and you want to get that. So for example, there might be a collection of plants that are the same colour. There might be a fruit and veg stall that you want to photograph, all those kinds of things. Thinking about how you want to bring colour into your image to make an impact on your viewer, and that's going to make your photographs look that much more vibrant and interesting. Okay, and the last topic we're going to look at is focus. Now, I am going to touch more on focus a little bit in another video, so remember to hit subscribe if you want to keep an eye out for that one when it gets uploaded. But basically, focus is thinking about two things really. What part of your image do you want your viewer to focus on? So is there a certain subject that you're photographing and you want your viewer to focus on that particular subject? So again, that comes back to the other things we've discussed, such as framing and leading lines and how you're going to get your viewer to focus on that part of your image. The second part of it is whether you want part of your image to be in focus and part of your image to be out of focus. Now again, as I mentioned, I'm going to be covering that in a little bit more detail in another video, but there are ways that you can do that on, for example, phones. On a phone camera nowadays, you get lots of different settings, and if you look at them, sometimes they come with selective focus, and that will let you have part of your image in focus and part of your image out of focus. Now that can be really effective, and a lot of photographers do use that technique when they're taking their photographs. It's usually really effective when you're shooting portraits, because then the person looking at your photograph is going to just focus on that person that you took a portrait of, rather than everything that's going on behind them. So again, that's something to consider. So I hope this video has been helpful. All of these things I've discussed, you don't necessarily need an SLR camera for. You can shoot these on a little compact camera, and you can use your phone. Obviously I mentioned when I discussed focus that you can use selective focus on your phone, and there are so many options for settings on phone cameras these days. You've got pro settings on some of them, so have a play around. You don't necessarily need a professional camera or an SLR. Just use whatever camera you've got and practice. The main key to getting these tips right is practice, practice, practice. Get the hang of them, get used to them, get used to how they improve your photographs. But I guarantee if you implement these tips, they are going to help you to take more awesome and more interesting photographs. But on the flip side of that, experiment a little and see what happens when you break these rules. See if that's more effective for your photograph and see where that takes you. So I hope that this video has been helpful. If it has, hit the like button below. Subscribe to my channel. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter, and leave a comment below and let me know what you thought.